Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
To share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So
many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm.
Homelessness and health.
Addiction and the new normal.
HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur. The leader is a communicator. The leader is a manager. The leader as a negotiator. The leader as a follower. And the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty. Episode 38 of HLA Live is hosted by our HLA scholar Christine Mahota and is entitled Resilience for Healthcare Professionals. It is a special episode for World Health Day.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us and welcome to this new episode of HLA Live. I am Christine Mahota, a fourth year medical student at Cardiff University and one of this year's HLA scholars. Now, I've been working as part of a great team called Mind Health, which aims to reduce stigma around mental health and to promote resilience and well-being in health professionals and students. I'm also a volunteer in Wales for Papyrus UK, which is a suicide prevention charity for young people. Now, it's a great honour for the first time, and I'm really excited to be hosting this brilliant panel here this evening. And this episode is important and very relevant for a number of reasons. As we know, the past year has been challenging and unpredictable due to COVID-19, as many of us have had to adapt, live and work differently through this ongoing global pandemic. And for some people, this has affected their mental well-being too, alongside other factors. And he showed us, I'm sure, that we cannot always predict and plan everything in life. We don't always know what life will throw at us. However, we've seen that people can, at the same time, be incredibly compassionate and resilient in the face of adversity, such as NHS staff, whom are here today as well. We need to look deeper into how to actually build our resilience and look after our well-being, as this is not talked about enough in the workplace and in training. And I'm hopeful that this discussion will empower you as a listener through hearing the stories, ideas and views of our panelists with tools that you can implement in your own life to build resilience through this pandemic and beyond, and also be encouraged to seek help if needed. So I'm joined today by an extraordinary panel of individuals who are amazing to get to know, and I'm sure you will hear a lot from them. And I will also let them introduce themselves in a second and tell you more about their specialities and their interest.
Thanks very much, Christine, and thanks for inviting me. If you'll have to excuse the rather attractive hairstyle, I've just got out of theatre and having not been able to see my barber for the last 3 months, it's probably looking a bit scary. So hopefully this is voice only, this session tonight. My name is Mark Stacey. I'm a consultant obstetric anaesthetist at Cardiff and Vale. I am coming sort of to the end of my career in anaesthetic, having been a consultant for 25 years. So my particular interest, apart from managing the particularly challenging clinical processes that I often have to deal with, is performance under pressure. And performance under pressure in a generic sense, so teaching individuals across specialties and across environments to perform in a very high pressure performance environment. I'm lucky enough to work with a professor of sports psychology and some of the elite military colleagues to look at things that we can learn from them, practical skills that we can all implement in our lives. I love skills teaching, and I have absolutely no doubt that if you embrace the processes of the way that you've trained in your past, you can use it to improve your future. So you'll learn a bit more about me as the session goes on, but that's me.
Hello, my name is Wafa Arman. I'm currently an assistant psychologist for an independent practice in the West Midlands. We work with adults and children with complex presentations, and I specifically work on doing cognitive functioning assessments of parents involved in care proceedings in family court. I'm really interested in trauma, specifically war-related trauma. And yeah, thank you for having me today.
Hi, so my name is Oliver. I'm an F1 in 17ry. I have the classic imposter syndrome of all medics tonight while being on a panel of professionals. But I have a sort of very personal interest in well-being and in mental health. And it's something that kind of gets me up in the morning, and I want to work in psychiatry, and I'm particularly interested in health positive approaches to psychiatry. And I think my interest has sort of really grown from a time in med school where I took a year out after my mental health collapsed, and developed really bad health anxiety, and as a result of which really kind of became obsessively interested in this question of health. And it was actually the only useful thing that, well, not only, one of the useful things that came out of that period was kind of really getting a grip on it for myself, as to how I could start to feel just better and happier in myself. And since then, Christine and I are now working together with Mind Health, which is kind of hoping to empower people with some practical tools for their mental well-being. When I was at university, I started something called the Birmingham Mindfulness Project, which was the culmination of quite a lot of work I've done with mindfulness and meditation. And I'm here today. So hi, nice to meet you all.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Jen. I'm a ST5 in old age psychiatry. I'm probably what is known as a forever trainee because it took me a little while to find my path into psychiatry. So I completed core medical training and GP training before I entered psychiatry, and then did all my training in psychiatry part-time. But I'm finally an SPR, made it. I have a special interest in leadership in healthcare. I'm currently completing an MSc at the University in South Wales in strategic leadership, and I'm currently a Royal College of Psychiatry Leadership Fellow this year, which is proving to be quite a steep learning curve, but it's been very valuable nonetheless. I had the pleasure of meeting Christine when she was with us on placement. So thank you very much for inviting me to join you today.
No worries, it was a very good day. So welcome, and thanks so much for joining me on time. And I'm sure it's going to be an interesting and hopefully thoughtful discussion. Now, to kickstart us off, I have a key question for you. What does resilience mean to you? And what have you learned through your own life story that has helped you to become more resilient?
You talked about imposters in the room, Oliver. I think I'm the person here with no aspirations to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm probably the biggest imposter. And you may ask yourself, what on earth is an anaesthetist doing talking about well-being? Well, resilience to me is both a static and a dynamic thing. And I think that is something that is often underappreciated by individuals, and that our ability to cope with the demands that are put upon us changes depending on the environment we put in, the people that support us, the skills that we have, and quite a lot of factors, some of which we can control and some of which we can't, which I suspect Oliver, with his interest in meditation, will be very familiar with. In terms of my personal journey, I got very interested in this particular topic when I was a registrar, so that is a hell of a long time ago. And I was struggling with trying to do the job I wanted to do, with looking after family, like many of us now, and trying to do exams. And I really decided that unless I actually actively approached this as a problem that I could solve in a typical way that medics do, then I wasn't really going to do very well. And that's when I discovered there was a whole world out there of stuff that I arrogantly didn't think I needed. Stress management's a tool, meditation. I discovered meditation at that time. And I've sort of gone on to develop and teach and manage a whole stack of other skills since, primarily because I'm interested in human performance, because you can only really perform well if you optimize all those skills. That's kind of how I look at it. I'll be very interested to hear what my psych colleagues think.
Yeah, I think resilience to me is just the ability to withstand and cope with maybe the different curveballs that life throws at us.
Yeah, and I think to cope with those curveballs, you either need external resources that are going to help you cope. So in the workplace, that might be better shift patterns or easy access to childcare or supportive supervisors, but also it's learning those internal resources that help you adapt and change and flex to allow you to become more resilient or more mentally tough or whatever the latest trendy buzzword is. It really is having a mixture of external and internal coping strategies that allow you to grow and develop. And those are hard things sometimes to tap into.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think we'll definitely delve deeper in soon actually in terms of what are those internal external factors that we can use as well. And Oliver, did you have anything else to add on to that?
Resilience is something that I've never really kind of thought about as the term itself. I realised that I've thought a lot about kind of the things that underpin in this area. And Christine, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to quote you actually from the last session that we had with the HLA, where you talk about seeing the opportunity in things. And you shared this beautiful story of how in your life you've started to see the opportunities and all of the challenges that you've faced. And for me, I think that's when we talk about resilience from a personal perspective, because I think that we also need to talk about resilience of communities, resilience of systems, and resilience in kind of a wider perspective. But when we talk about resilience from a personal perspective, as you alluded to, and from my own experience, it's about seeing where the opportunities are in life to make the most of situations which are difficult and to respond to life's challenges in ways that make us happier and support the people around us at the same time.
I think that's hit the nail on the head, and I really do resonate with a lot of what you've all said actually. And I think generally people, it's quite easy to generalize the word resilience as, something bad happens, you get back up and you carry on no matter what. But I think looking at the past year, and I'm sure from your own personal experiences, it's not that simple and it's not that straightforward, because actually those sort of diversities could be anything, from having a bad shift to traumas and threats and significant sources of stress, for example, family relationship problems or financial stresses. So there's kind of, how do we get all these different tools and use them in so many different scenarios, if that makes sense. So looking into kind of your own life, and you mentioned, Jen, about sort of having those internal, external factors. If somebody was to come to you and say, well, okay, I want to delve into that and actually see, how do I build my resilience? Do you mind going into that a little bit more?
I guess you can think of it as, like I said earlier, internal resources. So the resources that you have learned within yourself. They're not necessarily learned, some of them are some people seem naturally more resilient, and other people take time to learn their resilience over time. And then there's the external resilience that, like Oliver said about organizational resilience. That is so important. We've seen the NHS this year flex and adapt to something, that no one could have predicted was going to happen when it did. And it was a time of huge innovation and huge flexibility. And it really is important that continues to be built on now to help other people manage their own resilience.
Yeah, definitely agree. And Dr. Stacey, you mentioned about sort of it sounds like a turning point almost in your life when you're on sort of doing, you said to me that you were doing sort of 3 days on, and a really, really tough shift pattern, I think, at the time. And that turning point for you, my question actually to all of you is, does somebody have to go through adversity to be able to develop those internal factors? Does that make sense? Or are people born resilient? Or do we have to go through something that is that turning point, and then you're like, okay, sink or swim, I choose to swim? Do you see what I mean?
It's a very good question, actually, and it's interesting having supported many individuals over many years. what I've found is that some people are definitely more able to deal with whatever you want to call it, the load. And some people aren't, but they can be taught. Now, the issue about having one of the things I've certainly been encouraging over the last 10 years is, yes, if you have a horrible event, it might change you, it might point you down one of two paths. There's a term in the psychological literature called post-traumatic growth. I prefer to use the term anti-fragile, which is something gets stronger when you try and break it. So rather than getting into the concern I have about the use of the word resilience or mental toughness, I can't be bothered to get into that debate. I talk about the word anti-fragile. For many individuals, it's often the turning point in another direction. They will give up medicine, they'll go off to do other things. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's often a shame if they've spent their entire life training to do that. I've seen both pathways taken, but it's a very interesting concept, and people are different. I think the other point to make that I think is really, really important is we can all fail. I don't care how strong you are, how resilient you think you are, how well skilled you are. Everybody fails if you push hard enough. I discovered this for myself 10 years ago when I was been a consultant for 15 years. I had a series of absolutely horrendous events, both in my personal life and work.
I think what is so brilliant about all of you is just you're sharing your sort of lived experiences and sort of things that have worked for you, which is, I'm hoping other people can draw on that experience. And I think what you said about being anti-fragile at a time like this, I feel like inherently, are we as health professionals sort of inherently more resilient because you kind of have to be, if that makes sense, to deal with those things, to go back to work the next day despite having a rough time, is that something that you intrinsically have to have? It gets screened at interview, it gets screened at, different, I'm sure NHS job interviews, it gets screened all the time, but it's like, is it something that we all inherently have to have?
Absolutely. I know that when the pandemic broke, my husband got COVID. He's an A&E consultant. He managed to pick up COVID before they were even testing for it, and during that time then they announced the lockdown just as we were coming out of our isolation. There was childcare. I'd been placed in Bridgend, which was about 60 miles away from where I live. I had that commute on top. My mum is an ITU nurse and I was worrying about her, trying to meet all my educational requirements, and I just felt absolutely overwhelmed. But what I did recognize was that I needed to reach out and get some help and support. And I think it's understanding when you're at your limit, when your bucket is full and you can't take any more. It's understanding that that is the time to reach out. And I think that is something that maybe we don't teach enough throughout the curriculum at university, not just medicine, any of the healthcare professions. And it's allowing people to develop their understanding when they can say, I am at my limit and I need to reach into that toolkit to do something to help.
I love that, and I think what you said about that recognition that I actually need a bit of extra support. I think that is what people need to understand, and I think it's so lovely having us here today and showing that we've all gone through things that have been tough, and actually sometimes you might be able to pick yourself up in whichever way and whatever toolkit you use, but actually that external help is absolutely fine.
No, yeah, I completely agree about knowing your limits and seeking help, because sometimes, like for me, I'm quite an independent person and sometimes it feels hard to actually reach out for help. Yeah, so just breaking past that sort of barrier and actually admitting and knowing when you're at your limit and being able to sort of access the help that's out there.
I think as healthcare professionals, we like to feel like we're the people who are taking care of other people and that we're able to support other people. And I think there's potentially a perspective in that if we're not able to take care of ourselves, then kind of, we're failing at something. And I think the only thing I can add to the points that have been raised is that medicine seems like a treadmill. And I'm sure other people know this much better than I do, but it took me 7 years to get through medical school, and that year that I took out was a year where I fought against it like really, really hard, and I tried to stay in for as long as I could, because mostly I was terrified of having nothing to do and being at home alone all day. But I think once you actually take that jump and you take that leap and you actually step out, you recognize that the job's not going anywhere, you're not getting left behind. And that for me was a real perspective shift of being like, it's okay, I can take this time for myself, I can be there for me, and the job's not going anywhere.
That's so good to hear, and so thank you so much, all of you, for sharing. And actually, Oliver, look at you now. Actually that time out has obviously worked, which is great. And I think every time we go on holiday and they do the flight announcement, and no one ever listens to this, but when they say put your mask on first, then you're busy trying to find the film on the thing and you don't actually listen. But it's very, very true. Put your mask on first before other people. It's exactly the same. If you're not well, you can't then look after your patients for the best, to the best of your ability. And I think that what we said before about that support, it doesn't necessarily have to be, formal support. It could just be reaching out to friends. I know I've rang Wafa millions of times, like help, and that's also the same. What are kind of your sources of support sometimes?
I look at it slightly differently now to the way that Jen did, in that I actually think you don't want to get to that point where you need to ask for help. You want to be asking for help before you get to that point. And the problem with a lot of us is that we're very bad at recognizing that. And just going back to the sort of the selection question, which none of us really answered, I think there's absolutely no doubt that if you're going to come into this kind of environment, you have to be aware that bad things happen, COVID or not. And I spend my life telling medical students, and they look at me like I've grown two heads, I'm afraid you're going to go into a job where you'll do everything right and bad things will happen. And as an individual, that's very difficult to deal with. It's certainly something I have struggled with over the years, and have taught lots of other people. I'm probably better at teaching it than I am at managing it myself. So one of the things I try and encourage now is to have this prophylactic approach. Don't get to that point. Don't get to that falling off the cliff bit before you start asking for help on the way down. Do it before you get there. And we can all do that. You've just got to make a proactive approach to it. And it's certainly one of the things that we teach outside of medicine with sport and military, because of their high performance environment. They have to learn that lesson very quickly, otherwise they just don't succeed.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, actually. There was a BMJ article that looked into burnout in healthcare, and it was basically looking at a case for organisational change. And it basically acknowledged the fact that there is an issue, and that organisations need to actually focus on developing a healthy workplace and actually preventing the burnout in the first place, rather than just being reactive when people get to that point. And I think your point about sort of medical students all the time, kind of prepare yourself before you get there, because it's inevitably you're going to see bad things happen. In an ideal world, no one will be sick and we won't be needed, but that's just not how it works. And from your experience, how can someone begin to develop that? How can they be able to recognize that, what are the signs that people are looking for before they get too bad?
And this idea of kind of self-awareness is something that has just been such a big feature for myself over the last 3 years, of how do I recognize when things are difficult for me? How do I recognize when I'm turning to all of the old habitual patterns that, don't necessarily push me in the right direction? And for me, and I'd say this because it's helped me personally, has been exploring mindfulness and meditation. And when I was unwell, it was actually the thing that really kind of helped centered me and helped me to start building this awareness of how it was I was actually feeling at any given point in time. And if there was anxiety there, it was today there's anxiety here, or if there's depression, today there's depression, or whatever it was. And I think what I've taken from that period, and from a long time that I spent on retreats and things like that, is that I have this sense now of what's actually happening. And I know that I don't necessarily need to buy into it in the same way. I can let it be there. I can let the anxiety be there. I can let the imposter syndrome be there, whatever it is. And know that my instinctive reaction is going to be to have a drink, or to go and kind of do something that makes me feel like I'm kind of progressing in my career, or whatever it is, and just taking a step back and being like, it's all cool, it's all chill. So
yeah, definitely. And I think I can really appreciate that, actually, because I think you mentioned before as well, Oliver, about medicine feeling like a treadmill sometimes. And I'm sure, Wafa, as well, in your field of work, sometimes you I know where you're trying to get to as well, and it's kind of, you feel like I have to get this publication and do this first, and then I want to do this, and then there's so many things you're trying to tick off that list. You've got this sort of educational requirement alongside your work that you're trying to excel in, and sometimes how did you find that balance, Oliver? How did you get to a place where you can say, okay, today's just not my day, and that's okay, and I can let myself feel this? How did you get to that level?
With practice. When I was really unwell, I had severe OCD, and I don't know that people quite appreciate what OCD means, but it means that you have horrific intrusive thoughts that essentially make you hate yourself, and that's the bottom line of all OCD. And for me, at least, it was this process of learning to be nice to myself, asking, like, how can I actually be my own best friend today? And that cycle just repeating itself, and starting to recognize that if you start to take care of yourself, if you start to be kind and understanding towards the way that you are, that you're able to kind of turn towards things in a way that allows you to change things and to build a better future, rather than just get stuck in this thing that you never want to look at and you just want to run away from. And so for me, at least, it was this process of being forced to confront lots and lots of things and facing them and kind of recognizing all of these patterns, and then starting to find a way to change them and build something that was more productive.
I think it's really interesting, Oliver, what you're saying about OCD. I'm an anaesthetist. I think probably most of my colleagues, certainly the good ones, are all pretty much have a very much an OCD approach to their lives and their work. I mean, I thought up until about 2010 that I could control the weather, and discovered, as I say, after a series of very unfortunate events, that I couldn't. And one of the philosophies I've tried to embed both in myself and the people I work with and support is what they call the 3 C's of Stoic philosophy. So the first C is control what you can, and I think that the reality is sometimes we think we can control things we can't. The second C is cope with what you can't, and that's where I think skills like mindfulness are absolutely fantastically pretty much the only way of dealing with those particular processes. And the last C, which is, I'm ashamed to say, as a near 60-year-old, I've only really learned in my 50s, but I'm trying to encourage people to think about a lot more, is concentrate on what counts. And I think particularly in this last year, it's something that, as clinicians, you talked about the treadmill. You've got to decide, your time is your most important and most valuable asset. You've really got to be careful how you spend it. And I think certainly I look back on my life and probably spent a bit too much time working, and possibly a bit not enough time looking after the things that were slightly more important than work was. So that's my 3 C's I find very useful. If I get up, and as you say, get up in the morning, I'm thinking, right, how am I approaching this particular issue?
Sorry, I'll jump in again just because I love the kind of Stoic stuff as well. There's 2 quotes that stick with me from sort of the period that I've been through recently. And one is Epictetus, who says, "Learn to wish that everything should come to pass exactly as it does." And I remember looking at that and thinking, that doesn't sound possible, and it also doesn't sound like sensible. But actually exploring that has been kind of a sense of, can I accept that this is the way that things are right now, even if I hate it? And the second is a Greek expression, amor fati, which translates as love of fate, and it's this idea of kind of loving or just playing the cards that you're dealt, and not wishing that they were other than that they are. So yeah, there's my 2 points.
I think for me, it's as cheesy as it may sound, is actually accepting that it's okay not to be okay. Because I feel like a lot of times in the past, so for example, if I took a day off because I was unwell or had like a migraine episode, I would beat myself up about it, like, you should be working. At times I had to even convince myself, like, you're actually in pain, that's why you have a day off. So actually recognizing when you're not feeling well or when things are not going fine, and knowing that it's okay to feel that way, and sort of having self-compassion during those moments, and knowing that taking care of yourself is part of productivity and it's not counterproductive.
I think for me, I'm a bit of a ruminator and I'm a perfectionist. And add the 2 together means you can get really stuck on the small stuff. And I think I was listening to a TED talk one day, and the psychologist was talking about Viktor Frankl. I don't know if anyone's heard of him, but he's quite a world famous psychotherapist, but he's also a Holocaust survivor. and he's got this quote where he talks about having a stimulus and response, but between the stimulus and response there is a space, and within that space is your power to choose, and you can choose to grow, and you can choose your freedom. So what he means by that is, if the response is how you behave and the stimulus is what's stressing you out, you can create a space to change how you're behaving. So instead of, say I had a workplace-based assessment and it was majoritarily positive, and they always have to give you, there's always room to improve, so they give you some negative feedback, I would come home and sit on the sofa and really let that tick over in my mind. And actually what I've learned is I can choose not to do that. I can choose to behave differently, and instead think of a much more positive coping strategy. So my poor kids get dragged up the mountain now for a walk. But that is, a much more positive way of distracting myself from those ruminations. And I just think it's a really powerful quote. And, we do have a choice to choose to manage our emotions and feelings and then our behavior differently. And it's really important to develop those skills to allow you to do that.
I think that's a fabulous summary of Frankel's work. There's another Holocaust survivor author that's worth looking at if you want to read some more about that kind of stuff, called Edith Eger, who's the female equivalent. She also survived the concentration camps through the Second World War. And one of the books she's written is called The Choice, and she explores exactly that concept. And it's something that we talk about on our courses when we're dealing with individuals who've suffered what we call a potentially traumatic event, not a traumatic event, because it's not the event so much that's the problem, it's our interpretation of that. It's the emotion that we put on that, it's the choice and how we decide to approach that. And I think what's interesting, there's another quote that Frankel uses, which I use a lot, which of course I can't remember now because I'm faced by your intelligent faces, but it's along the lines of, when you're dealing with a problem, you have a choice to either treat that problem as a threat or a challenge. And if you treat it as a threat, it causes exactly the same response as if it was a real threat. So COVID's a good example for I've been working in the front line for the last year. Yes, it's there. But actually there are other things that I could get disastrously wrong in my work if I don't actually focus on my work. So I've approached it, look, it's a challenge, I'm going to have to deal with it, I'm going to have to wear all the annoying PPE and stuff, but I'm going to do the best I can for my patients. And one of the things about human beings, as I said earlier, is we are fantastic problem solvers. But if you embrace the problem as a threat, you won't try and solve that problem. So that was a lovely summary, actually. I love that bit about the space, as you say, between the stimulus and the response.
Yeah, I think it's just recognizing that you can choose to react in a different way. I think we all get really stuck sometimes in our behaviors, and it's just actually saying, okay, I need to do things a bit differently. My husband's a bit of he's an A&E consultant, so he's probably very different minded to me, and he realized he needed to start behaving differently, so he's got really into Wim Hof and is having ice cold showers every morning.
Yes. Old Wim Hof, that's crazy stuff. That's completely crazy stuff.
But I guess I was thinking about it, and I guess it is a form of mindfulness though.
Can I ask a question of the group, which is that for people who don't have that space, who feel like they don't have that space, who feel as though these things happen and there's no controlling them, how can we support people, or how can people support themselves to grow that space?
Okay, so one of the simplest skills I teach, and you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, Oliver, is what's called box breathing. And what you're doing in box breathing is, so just for the audience really, is the plan is you breathe in and you count 4, you hold for the count of 4, breathe out for the count of 4, hold for the count of 4. And I say to people, when you feel that panic coming on, do it 4 times or do it for longer as necessary. I teach it to patients, I teach it to trainees, I teach it to consultant colleagues. And what you're doing with that particular process, if you practice it in a non-stress environment, so that you can use it in a stress environment, is you're using your physiology to control your psychology. Because what that slowing, and it's a bit like the Wim Hof stuff, it's the same sort of physiological background. It slows your heart rate right down. It stops you generating that acute sympathetic nervous response, the tachycardia, the hypertension, the feelings of fear, the shaky hands. And just by doing that, it brings you back an opportunity to create a space, so that you can then reframe the way that you're addressing that problem. It's actually a surprisingly powerful tool. Some of my colleagues use it if they can't sleep at night as well. Interestingly, we the special forces learn it, and we've been teaching it to a lot of our elite athletes, because when they're got severe performance anxiety, it enables them to bring things, because they understand this physiology bit. And I think as clinicians, we should hopefully also understand that physiology bit. So that's one skill. There are lots of other skills, but that's a really powerful one.
What I really take home from that is the sense of that space and knowing how to create that space. As although you're saying it's a simple thing, but actually if you practice that and able to do that when you most need it, like you said, that could literally make all the difference between you being, too stressed to your job and actually you being able to control yourself and get back to yourself to a grounding level. And I really like what you said about kind of doing the best that you can. And I think, are we getting into this culture part where people always want to do more? There's always more to do, and I can't, fall down for too long because there's always more to do and I got to get there. Like, what is just your best? And how do we get to this point where we're just okay with we're doing the best we can right now, but for some reason in the back of our head, I don't know if it's just human nature, but we're always like, oh, we've just got to do more, we've got to keep going. Sometimes actually what you said about creating that space and going for that walk up the mountain, it doesn't have to be complicated, right?
It doesn't have to be long either. So Oliver was asking for, skills, and I guess that box breathing exercise is so good because you can do it in 30 seconds, It doesn't have to be a 2-hour trek up a mountain to create that space. There are very small things you can do to change your behaviours. It doesn't have to be something very exciting, but just something like a breathing technique. Other people, if they can feel the anxiety building, like the sort of plunging their hands in cold water or the snapping their elastic band against their wrist to help ground them. It can be anything really, and what you need to do is try and see what works for you, because everyone is different, and what works for me won't necessarily work for the next person.
I think for me there's this sense of when I recognize that something's going on, it's just about pausing just in that moment, and it's just recognizing something's going on, and I don't necessarily need to understand it completely, but something's going on, and if I don't pause now, I'm going to lash out, or I'm going to do something that's kind of not very helpful. And just having that moment of okay, and then it's that moment of having a look inside and being like, so what's actually going on, and then giving it a name maybe, and then trying to somehow bring some level of self-compassion to that, and just trying to diffuse the whole kind of vicious cycle that goes around it, where you're kind of like, why do I feel like this, and beating yourself up, and then finding some way of responding that's practical.
Yeah, I think in light of that, one of the skills I've learned from mindfulness, it's a basic thing adding onto your normal routine. So we don't think about, there's a lot of things we do on autopilot. So whether that's like showering in the morning, brushing your teeth. So picking one of those things that you do. So whether it's showering and really being in that moment. So like smelling your bath soap, feeling so just thinking about all your senses and being in that moment, as opposed to like thinking, what am I going to do today? This is what I need to do, and that sort of thing. So really being present in that moment and just picking one thing that you do every day where you will be fully present in that moment. And
if you fancy trying the Wim Hof technique of having the cold showers, I tell you at the moment they are really cold, and you suddenly become very aware of just how cold they are.
But I think it is, again, it's coming back to that, what works for you, because hell will freeze over before I have a cold shower. I mean, there's no way I'm going to do that. And also I know that I am quite an active person, so the traditional forms of mindfulness I find very difficult. But something that might be going out for a walk and doing what Wafa said with the senses, or just going out for a walk and putting my phone in my pocket and saying I'm not going to look at it for the next hour, is sometimes just enough. It doesn't have to be something fancy.
I'm glad you mentioned phones, because it's one of my big bugbears. Okay, so a couple of things about phones. First thing is ban them from the bedroom. Unless you're on call, don't have your phone in your bedroom. And same for your kids if you've got kids, particularly if they've got phones. The second thing is there's some work that came out, there was a publication last year, and it's something that wasn't surprised to read about, is the effect that if you use your phone when you're having your break, let's say a coffee break or your lunch break, it actually interferes with your performance after that break. So on my labour ward, actually it drives the midwives mad, is we ban the phones from the break room, and what we try and encourage is to actually have a conversation around recipes. So often people will have cooked something, oh, that's really nice, how did you make that? And then we'll swap these recipes. I discovered the tray bake books on the back of one of these, and if you haven't tried them, particularly those of you who are working and like your food, there are some fantastic recipes in there that are so easy to do, even I can't mess them up. But I wouldn't have learned that if we'd been looking at our phones. So ban the phone.
Your phone gives you this constant influx of sensory information, and so looking at it in your break, you're not giving yourself time to switch off. You're also isolating yourself because you've got your eyes down at your phone, and instead you really need to be engaging with your peer group for peer support, you know, in the mess or in
absolutely.
Yeah, phones are one of my bugbears too, and I think it links so much into sleep. So looking at your phone before bedtime is akin to having a couple of cups of coffee, I think the research is. And I know that when I'm on call and I've got my phone next to me, my sleep is just dreadful. So yeah, I agree with Mark that phones stay outside.
I'm so glad that we brought this up. The last 2 weeks, I've always been, I always say my sleep is the most important thing to me, and it's the one thing that I always fail at, and it's never been good. And the last 2 weeks ago, it was just this stretch of just not getting sleep for just like an hour, nothing horrific, but just enough to be like, this is really annoying. I was like, I'm going to implement a really strict routine, and it's one that I've done forever. I'll be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to put my phone on charge like an hour before, and then I'm going to do all these things. But this time I was like, no, you're going to do it seriously. So I've been putting my phone on charge an hour before, putting my laptop away, and then having to find something to do in the meantime. And I don't read fiction because I'm just not a fiction person. But the last 2 weeks, I sat down with a very good book and have been reading that, and having a shower and things that kind of help me unwind. And I've been falling asleep in 10-15 minutes as opposed to 45 minutes or an hour. And because I'm starting to build that in, when it gets to 11 o'clock, I'm like, okay, right, it's time to get to bed now. And it's the last 4 days I completely slipped, and yesterday I completely got back on schedule again. So it comes and goes, but that's what I'm working on at the moment.
I think sleep for healthcare professionals, it's so important for your mental well-being, and yet we work these crazy shift patterns. The nurses will work a long day and then come in for an early shift the next day. That it is so detrimental to our physical health and our mental health. And I think teaching good sleep hygiene and the importance of rest should begin on day one at university.
I totally agree, Jenna. Again, the research on performance, particularly, so this is outside of medicine, but it's true of medicine as of any other high performance environment. Sleep is the most important performance enhancing agent we have. You mess it up at your peril, really. And you know what it's like. If you have a good night's sleep, you wake up in the morning, you can take on the world. You have a bad night's sleep, that's a wholly different settle of fish.
Yeah, I think, thank you so much, all of you, for sharing. And I think good sleep hygiene, when you said about the phone, I thought, oh no. This is going to be really hard. I thought anything else.
One of the things you need to do, but you don't want to hear.
You're like, I know. Literally, when Oliver was like, I'm falling asleep in 10 minutes, I'm just there 2 hours later, like rolling around, like on different TikTok videos. And, okay, I need to, see, we're not perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm still working on it as well. So I think we mentioned before as well. So some of just to summarize some of the sort of skills that we've come up with actually. So something, really as simple as breathing exercises, so box breathing, and sort of practicing that so they can actually enforce that when needed. Something like, for example, putting your hand in cold water, or having a rubber band around your wrist. Find anything that kind of works for you and practicing that to ground yourself. And also what I mentioned about being in the moment. So it could be something that you do on a daily basis, just showering, and just actually be there. Don't think about the work list you've got to do or the long drive to work, and just try and actually focus in that time. If you're an active person, you consider exercising or going out for a walk without your phone. we'll try. And also having conversations with your colleagues as well at work, and watching your screen time while you're there as well on breaks, as that can affect productivity. And also just have a pause, like Oliver said, and think about what's actually going on around you and have some self-compassion, and then good sleep hygiene and looking after yourself is a priority. I think that learning that, I find it so much easier, and it might just be me, to look after other people. When it comes to myself, I just somehow can't always apply the same principles. One thing I wanted to touch up on actually is, we mentioned this before about support, and I think this is something that I don't know if it's just with healthcare professionals. I don't know if we're afraid of vulnerability, but there is definitely a culture. I don't want to call it a culture, but I think generally speaking, there is still a stigma around mental health. Even just in general population, you have to look at the sort of yesterday. Meghan Markle, for example, I know she's not in healthcare, but I'm trying to say it's still something that we need to destigmatize and work on, to actually say, it's completely okay to seek help. What advice would you give to somebody who's struggling with that?
Well, I think you're totally right. We know that the symptoms of burnout, will lead to depression, anxiety, and other associated mental illness. And we know that, mental illness is common amongst healthcare professionals. I think it's about 25% are at risk of mental illness during their career, and with suicide rates, in the profession being about 2 to 4 times higher across all specialities, some more than others. So psychiatry and anaesthetists have particularly higher rates, as well as GPs. I think, seeking early, timely help is the most important thing you can do, and trying to pick things up early. The other thing I wanted to touch on is international medical graduates, because they have a very different set of needs, and they are also much more at risk of mental illness, self-harm and suicide. And I think, they need a lot of extra and different support to what British medical graduates need. And I think it's just being aware of that, and so that it can be offered early.
I know lots of people who want to get help, or they think that they should get help, but there's something that really holds them back. And I wondered what it is that holds people back, and how we can help people to somehow reach out.
Stigma and prejudice, mental illness is still very much around. You only have to pick up the paper today and you can see the stigma of saying you've had suicidal thoughts. That's been all over the press today. The culture within medicine and dentistry, I would argue, is not that supportive of people with mental illness. That's not across the board, but that's a sort of very general observation. And I think that in medicine and healthcare, we worry about reaching out for support because of the impact it might have on your career development and your career progression, and the concerns around, being reported to the GMC or the NMC and other regulatory bodies is huge. And it's a really stressful experience to go through if you do end up being reported to the GMC. So I think, that can exacerbate things and really delay people seeking help. The other thing I always think about is, particularly amongst GPs and psychiatrists, is, well, who do I go to? Because I know all the GPs and psychiatrists here, and I don't want to tell them that I'm struggling with my mood, or I'm having suicidal thoughts, or I'm feeling burnt out, or whatever it is. And so actually feeling able to access support can be really hard. And I think that's when it's important to know of alternative options outside the healthcare system.
Yeah, and I think, Jen, I think it's important to add to that as individuals, we can be adverts, if you like. I run a course, wellbeing course, and on that course I tell the story of my annus horribilis in 2010. And there is no doubt that on the back of that, even quite senior consultants will suddenly think, well, hang on a sec, I probably do need to start looking for some kind of support, because that bloke looks like he kind of knows what he's doing, and he kind of comes across as somebody who's fairly confident and fairly resilient, and yet he's just described a car crash. I think you guys certainly got some quite powerful stories which can reframe the way that your colleagues think about mental health. I mean, I agree with you, there is still a stigma attached, but it's nothing like it was 20 years ago. It is getting better. You know, I've been around long enough to certainly think when I was a trainee, you would just not have mentioned it. You know, if I had mentioned meditation as a registrar, I think they all think I'm slightly bonkers anyway, but they would definitely be ringing you guys up to get me admitted. And now it's much more, you know, people realize it's a skill and it's a very valuable skill. But like any skill, if it's going to be any use to you, you've got to practice it. I do think there's a real issue around who you go and see. I always encourage my colleagues who I can see are struggling to see their GP, because in general, I think general practitioners are pretty good. Occy health is a problem, certainly in a lot of environments. They just do not have the spare bandwidth to look after the volume of work, and the volume of work that will be created by this pandemic is going to far outstrip what we had before.
Yeah, I think, you know, the stigma is reducing. You know, these conversations are a sign of that. But I don't know of many people who would sit in the mess and say, I saw my GP today because I'm struggling with my mood. I still think that there's a lot of work to be done around having those conversations.
Sometimes it's just so overwhelming that even to just take that first step and to acknowledge that and to kind of like admit to just things can be so overwhelming, and it's actually so difficult. And actually, I think that from what I've learned for myself is that actually it was only when a sort of crisis hit that I actually sort of said to myself, okay, I actually do need to look at these things, but it's so hard that actually it's just not something that's pleasurable.
But ideally, you shouldn't get to that stage, Oliver. I mean, I think what you need is a different culture, and things are changing. I've seen changes in my own hospital for the better. They're not as fast as I would like, but then they never are. You know, it's like any sort of, it's not really a new initiative, but initiative that has been around for a long time. It is beginning to gain a bit of traction. And ideally, you know, we certainly in anaesthetics, we make a very, very positive, because as Jen pointed out, we're not great on the suicide. Well, actually, we're really quite good on the suicide list, which is not a thing to be top of the league of. But we work very hard with our trainees to make sure that we have got a sort of handle on how bad things are for them. And, you know, they've been amazing this year. Absolutely amazing, considering how tough a year they've had, because the majority of care of the very challenging patients has fallen to them, not to the consultant.
I think there's been real steps made, particularly this year. There has been a real shift in the focus of the emotional well-being of the workforce. You know, you saw wobble rooms and safe spaces and all sorts of initiatives set up very quickly in response to the pandemic. But it is keeping that momentum up now and really continuing that push.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Jen. Wafa, do you feel like the cogwheels are slowly turning?
Yeah, I think there's definitely changes and progression through the years, but it's still as much still alive. Like, people are still ashamed to speak about mental health, but I think it's really important to sort of frame mental health in a similar way that we frame physical health, or at the same level, in that the way it's not a shame to catch a cold, it's not a shame to break your arm. So it's the same way when you're not feeling well mentally, there's also no shame in that and in seeking help for that. So I think it's really important to frame it in that way and know that it's the same way as feeling physically unwell, and there is no shame in seeking help for that.
Exactly, and I would really like to echo everything that, you know, all of you have said. And I think the reason I got interested in mental health actually was from my own experience. I sort of I think it took going through a really tough time at university. And I think when I was in front of my doctor, you know, with days of not sleeping, you get put on, you know, it really, really was horrible. And I think for me, it was, I just, you know, went straight to, in my head, I didn't even sort of stop thinking I need to get help, because I knew if I don't get help, it's only going to get worse. But I think some people get this barrier of being like, okay, is it bad enough for me to go? If you think it's bad enough for you, if you're struggling, then it is important to go and get help. It doesn't matter how big it is in comparison to other people. You know, I think one time I thought, oh, but there's a pandemic going on. Well, it's been going on for a year. You know, I think there's always something worse to think about and to compare to.
Yeah, and I think one thing as well is important. Obviously, I understand not everyone has this, but to make use of your social support. So sometimes you may feel like you're burdening people with the issues, but I think it makes such a difference. For example, like you were saying, you do call me and I call you. So even that one phone call to a friend or to family does make a massive difference in the long run.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think for me, one of the biggest problems that we've had in terms of trying to manage the well-being of our staff is the lack of social support, the lack of the ability to have a conversation without a mask in a safe environment with possibly a beer is incredibly valuable in managing some, bad things happen on my ward even without COVID, and they have happened before COVID and they will happen after COVID. But one of the things probably, and I think you're absolutely right, for me, that has been the biggest problem, that the sessions that are, that the various public health bodies have done in terms of trying to manage this pandemic. I think that has caused us immense problems in the health service, and will for the long term. And I think it is genuinely something, and I've written to our health minister to say you need to address this. It's not something you can ignore, because it's hugely important that we are in some way enabled to look after each other. Yes, it's nice to be able to ring, but wouldn't it be nice to meet face to face? I mean, for me, I've really struggled with that this year. Really, really struggled.
Yeah, I think that face-to-face contact is key. So where I work, there is probably the health board's over about a 40-mile radius, and trainees are scattered across all these tiny mental health units and are often the only trainee there. And they're missing out on their weekly teaching sessions, which would bring the trainees together and allow them time, to offload, to have a whinge, to talk about the bosses, to talk about what they're doing over the weekend, and all those things that you rely on for peer support. And we have really noticed the impact that lack of face-to-face time has had on particularly our very junior trainees who have just started working in mental health, and they're probably seeing some quite distressing things as well.
Yeah, and I think what you said about sort of where do we go from here, we might not even really understand the psychological impact that this pandemic has had, across the board, but also within our own working practice. And me as a student, it resonates with me a lot. It's been very hard not to meet up with people and go out, and I think you only realise how blessed you are when you don't have those things, isn't it? So thank you so much, all of you, for your input tonight. This has been really, really interesting, and I think what I'd want to do now is just kind of bring it to a bit of a close tonight. And thank you so much, because I think what I wanted, and I think we've achieved, is having people like yourselves, who are incredible people, so openly talk about mental health, resilience, and the struggle that you can have, but also the skills that you can implement and practice, and that it is a practice. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as we always say, and that you can still live with all these experiences and the power of your experiences, but you can also keep going. But there's actually ways of learning how to do that, and I just thank you so much for your time. And I also want to thank the HLA for the opportunity to host this discussion and bring this important topic of resilience to light. And hopefully this increase in awareness is the very first step. Very small step, but in the right direction. And I really hope that you stay tuned for more HLA episodes on this topic, including self-care, mindfulness, and performance in elite athletes, which we'll be exploring a little bit more later on. And we'll put some helpful organisations, and I'll summarise the resources that we've been talking about in the description box below if you need any more information. Thank you so much for listening, and also to our panellists, thank you for your time, and take care.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlwana, the director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.